evening and welcome to the debut of the Fantasy Film Festivals, an irregularly scheduled series of science fiction, fantasy, and horror films. I'm Mick Garris and I'll be leading you into some of Hollywood's weirder worlds. On each installment of the Fantasy Film Festival, we'll bring you some of the best genre films that we can dig up. Not only will we be showing those films as they were intended to be seen, uncut and uninterrupted, but we'll also be talking with the people who made them. Some of the world's most creative movie minds are to be found at work in the fantasy field. Popular directors like George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, John Landis, Francis Coppola all had their beginnings in low-budget science fiction and horror films. It's a field rich in imagination, and imagination is what the Fantasy Film Festival is all about. To start us off on the right foot, we've selected Zardoz as our first feature. It's a prophetic look at life on Earth in the year 2293. To help us inaugurate the Fantasy Film Festival, we're pleased to welcome our special guest, the writer, the producer, and the director of Zardoz, all one man, John Boorman. It's good to have you here. To start off with, you've dealt with strong reality in Deliverance and Point Blank. Zardoz came after the success of Deliverance, where it seemed you could do whatever you wanted to do. And you created a fantasy. Which appeals to you more?
Well, I like the world of fantasy because realism, I think, is becoming boring. I think the real world is quite boring too, really. And so worlds of imagination are much more interesting to me. And Zardoz belongs to that category of films that you've been describing, and we don't really have quite a word for it in the French call it film fantastique, which doesn't mean the same thing as fantasy film. I think that I call them dream films. They're films that come out of the imagination. They're linked to the world of dreams, and some of them are nightmares, of course. And even my realistic films, like Deliverance and Point Blank, that you refer to, were films that touched on that world of dream. That I was using nightmare images to link in with an audience's fears, to plug into their unconscious. And I think that's what these pictures do. They do plug into the unconscious, and they're manifestations of that dark underworld.
Right. You enjoy manipulating people's fears, or?
Well, I think one of the nicest things you can do for people is to terrify them. And I'd like to do that whenever I can. Mm-hmm. Although Zardoz is not really frightening, it's much more, it frightens you only because it's another world. I think the world is very much like ours, but it's also different in ways that are very disturbing.
How so?
Well, it's the people, I think, are, I mean, it's not a science fiction world. It's not a world of technology. And I felt, because I'm not really interested in science part of science fiction, because I think the future won't be scientific. It won't be about hardware. So in Zardoz, the technology has been totally inverted. It's so integrated with the human mind and the human brain and the human nervous system that you don't see things. There aren't machines and press buttons and things.
Right, no phasers or lasers.
That's right. But there are no quasars either. But just the communicator ring, the crystal ring, in which people communicate sort of mind to mind, and everything is there that they need. So I think there's probably a more reasonable, more logical future than some others that we see.
Is this a future to fear to you?
Well, this is a fearful situation because these people are immortal. And not only are they immortal in Zardoz, but they don't have the option to die. Mm-hmm. Because having made themselves immortal, they're the custodians of knowledge, and therefore it's very important they survive. They no longer can reproduce, so they live on. And what they crave for, most of them, is death. And I've shown really that without death, I think, that there is no real savor in life.
Living on the brink.
Yeah.
Well, it seems that a theme runs through all of your films. A major character or characters thrust into a world that's foreign to them, something where they are the alien. What prompts this to be a theme in your films?
I suppose it comes out of a sense that I have of being an alien in this world. And I think it's not just something that I feel. I think everyone feels it at one time or another. I mean, you know, there comes a moment when you look at your hand, you say, what an extraordinary thing that is, to be hanging out of my sleeve. Or, and the feeling of just being in a place that you don't really belong in the world. And I always had that feeling very strongly as a child that there was some terrible mistake had been made, you know, and that I was surely meant for some other place. I mean, there must be something better than this. And so I started inventing things. And the problem is I keep inventing worlds that are even worse than the one that we
Positive
inhabit.
negativism. The Zardoz Godhead, let's get specific about some of the things. How big was that? And how was it...
How was it done?
How was it done?
You want me to spoil all the fun?
Yes.
Well, it's after Magritte, of course. This great. You remember there's a Magritte picture of an enormous rock floating in the sky.
Right.
And so that was where the idea came from. And here mine is a bit different because it's a head, and with a terrifying visage, which flies through the sky. And I love this notion of something heavy like that, you know, that's able to fly in the sky. And of course, it immediately tells you that they've learned quite a bit more about gravity than we know.
Right.
Now, how it was done was that it's done in a number of ways, and there are a number of heads of different sizes, according to the shot.
Ranging in what size?
What was necessary. Well, it was I'll tell you a funny story. When the picture opened in Paris, where it was a great success, the reviews were all very good. Everyone liked the picture, the critics, except for one critic of L'Humanité, the communist newspaper, who was very nervous, and clearly there was something disturbing him. And eventually he asked me to go and see him at the office of L'Humanité, and I went along, and he said, he said, "Is that Karl Marx?" I said, "No." He said, you sure it's not based on Karl Marx? Because it looks like him. Right. And I said, no. He said, well, and he was very embarrassed, and he said, would you mind putting it in writing? And he prepared this letter, which I
You denied Karl Marx was God, right?
Because he thought that perhaps it was an elaborate hoax to make fun of Marxism, and that he was going to write a favorable review, and then I would reveal that what the truth was, and that's how nervous those guys are, you know.
Yes, political statements.
Yeah.
I've noticed in your films, The Heretic and Zardoz in particular, your use of color seems to be very well thought out.
Yeah, because color is a problem. I think that I talked about films being close to dream, and I think that most people dream either in black and white or in certain monochrome colors. Color is somehow a problem for me, and I started with point blank of doing each scene in a separate color, only one color for each scene, and I've dealt with color in various ways. In Deliverance, for instance, the color was desaturated; it was sort of semi-black and white. And Zardoz actually is the most colorful film I think that I've made, because they're very pastel colors. It's brilliantly photographed by Geoffrey Unsworth, who recently died. He was one of the greatest cameramen of all time, and he had such a sensitivity to light. This is one of his very favorite films, because we did it photographically. There's a great deal of experiment and a great deal of pushing to the very limits of what you can get in terms of color.
Well, all of your films seem to be pretty experimental. the use of the Steadicam in The Heretic, and William Fraker. You seem to work closely with the best cinematographers in the business. Do you choose them to work with your philosophies of color and image?
Yes, I think that I'm very concerned about the visual look of the picture, and I try to work with cameramen who are responsive and plan. I mean, the key thing is to plan beforehand what your intentions are, what the style, what of the picture is going to be, how you're going to see it and photograph it. Because a cameraman is limited in what he can do. He can only photograph what you put in front of him. And if you haven't designed your sets, for instance, if you want a harmony in color or tone or style, then if it's not in the sets, there's a limit to what a cameraman can do. So all those things have to be integrated.
In dealing with fantasy, what is the most important thing to do? You have to make it believable, no matter how wild the fantasy. To you, what's the most important way to make a future world like Zardoz
The most important thing is to be consistent, is to invent a world which is utterly consistent. People will accept anything providing it is consistent. Zardoz is not perhaps consistent enough in some respects, but if you make a world and people can enter into it, I mean, that's what it's all about, really, isn't it? It's entering into another world, and you have the pleasure of seeing this other world, and you also have the added pleasure of escaping this one.
What do you think were the inconsistencies in Zardoz that you might have handled differently?
Well, the inconsistencies in Zardoz are not so much visually, but in the ideas and the philosophy. There's just a bit too much going on, and there are too many conflicting ideas that don't quite get played out.
Okay. Much of the Zardoz world is futuristic, and even more of it reflects the past than does the technological world we talked about earlier. Do you think this is how the world will be?
You know, it's a curious thing that people often said this to me, well, do you think that's what is going to happen? And no, the answer is not at all, because I think with science fiction films or fantasy films, one is indulging imagination. Now, what I do think about the future is this. I think the future is about imagination. Imagination is what will save the world, because I think if the power of imagination is such that we can achieve almost anything out of it. And once something has been imagined, it can happen. Imagination is the leading edge of evolution. I think that evolution is being conducted in the area of imagination. And I think that's what's exciting about fantasy films, is that it's an exploration of the future. It's not saying what the future is, but it's investigating the possibilities. And out of those possibilities, we can perhaps invent a future, all of us, that is habitable and perhaps even marvelous.
So our future is in the hands of the artists. And the artist we're speaking with tonight is John Boorman, and in just a few moments you'll be seeing this future world we've been talking about, the world of Zardoz. I want to thank you for being here, Mr. Boorman.
Thank you
helping us open the show. Thank you much.
Good luck with it.
Thank you.